All right, hey guys, we're going to talk about the endocrine system. Just very briefly, go through a quick overview of the endocrine system. So we know that the the nervous system and the endocrine system, they're going to work together to monitor the body's activities, right? Whereas the nervous system is going to produce those short-term, very specific, localized responses. Whereas the endocrine system, right, many times it's going to produce long-term, general responses, okay? So the endocrine system is going to release these chemicals called hormones, okay? These hormones are going to be produced by those endocrine cells or glands, right? Or these endocrine cells are going to be located in glands or gland-like structures, right? Once these chemicals or these hormones are going to be produced and secreted, they're going to be able to enter into the bloodstream, right? Once they're in the bloodstream, they're going to travel to its target organ or tissue, right? And so, of course, it's going to be in the whole blood supply, the whole systemic supply. However, that hormone is only going to bind to a specific target cell. Why? Because that specific target cell has a specific target hormone receptor for that chemical, for that hormone, right? So each, those target cells are going to have a specific receptor that's going to take up, or that's going to be able to bind with a specific hormone. So that hormone can be circulating throughout the body, right? It doesn't mean it's going to communicate with other type of cells, for which it just doesn't need to, okay? So we're going to have this receptor binding, right? This specificity there where that hormone, again, is going to only target and bind to a specific cell, okay? And so these hormones, once they bind, of course, they're going to cause that target cell or that tissue to respond in some type of way, right? So we have the main endocrine organs. Those are going to be the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid gland, the adrenal gland, the pineal gland, the parathyroid glands, and the pancreas, right? And we also have some organs with secondary endocrine functions, such as the heart, the thymus, adipose tissue, our digestive tract, our kidneys, and our gonads, such as the testes and the ovaries, right? They're going to have some endocrine functions. Now, right here is just an overview, right, of the endocrine system, where we have the main endocrine organs that I mentioned, as well as some organs with secondary endocrine functions, right? And literally just the hormones that they're going to produce, okay? But we're going to hit into those. So hormones, right, these chemical structures that are going to be secreted by these endocrine cells, hormone means to excite. Right, so we classify hormones into three main categories based on their chemical structure. We have the amino acid derivative hormones, the peptide hormones, and the lipid derivatives. Those lipid derivatives are going to typically be those steroids and those eicosanoids, right? And so when we're looking at the amino acid derivative hormones, they're going to be structurally similar to amino acids, right? And we give some examples such as some derivatives of tyrosine. There's going to be like the thyroid hormones, right? Those catecholamines, right? Those thyroid hormones being the T3, T4 calcitonin, that catecholamines being the epinephrine and norepinephrine that's going to be released by the adrenal gland. And the melatonin is also an amino acid derivative, right? It's going to be released by the pineal gland, but it's a derivative of tryptophan, the amino acid, right? Then we have these peptide hormones. Remember, peptides are just chains of amino acids. So these are going to be hormones that are chains of amino acids, right? And so all of the hormones from the pituitary gland, right, such as the growth hormone, the thyroid-stimulated hormone, the follicle-stimulated hormone, luteinizing hormone, all of these coming from the pituitary gland are going to be peptide hormones, okay? It's going to be peptide hormones. Now we have those lipid derivative hormones, right? They're going to be divided into two groups. You have these steroid hormones, right? They're going to be derived from cholesterol, right? And that could be those hormones from the reproductive system, right? Or those adrenal cortex hormones, okay? And then these eicosanoids, they're going to be derived from arachidonic acid, which is a fatty acid of a cell membrane. These are going to be released by many cells, but they're going to be really associated with like blood clotting. So to start off with our discussion of endocrine, right, we really want to start off at the master regulator, right? We call the hypothalamus that master regulator because the hypothalamus is able to integrate neural and endocrine activities, right? So it kind of acts in both systems, right? The nervous system and the endocrine system, okay? And how it integrates its neural and endocrine activity is via these three methods, right? The hypothalamus is able to act as an endocrine organ, where it's able to release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin, at the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus also acts to integrate its neural and endocrine activity by secreting regulatory hormones. Okay, these regulatory hormones will control the activity of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. And then, finally, the hypothalamus integrates its neural and endocrine activity by containing autonomic nervous system centers, where it's able to exert control over the adrenal medulla. Okay, so directly. So this just gives us a quick overview so we can remember, right, where that hypothalamus is. This is the hypothalamus region, okay, within the brain. Okay. And we're going to also see how that infundibulum is going to be important right there. This infundibulum, that's going to connect the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. Okay. And so we're going to see how this hypothalamus will then be able to secrete antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay. And of course, that's going to be its endocrine function, right? For its, neural function is that center for emotional and behavioral drives and those thirst drives, being able to coordinate between voluntary and autonomic functions, right? So the hypothalamus is going to be a very, very important system, right? And so, organ, right? And so we're going to really be focusing on the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei when we're talking about the posterior lobe, okay? So let's look at it a little bit more. Okay. So this again is those three ways of how the hypothalamus integrates its neural and endocrine activity. Okay. Again, number one is able to produce hormones, oxytocin and ADH. Right. So they're able to produce it right here. Okay. And these two different nuclei, the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei. Okay. After they produce these two hormones, they transport them down their axons. Right. And then they're stored here, right, in this pituitary gland, right, the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So they're stored and released there from the pituitary gland, the posterior lobe. So again, these hypothalamic neurons, they're able to produce ADH and oxytocin. However, that ADH and oxytocin is released into the circulation via the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Number two, right, there are integrator systems or centers within the hypothalamus that is able to release these regulatory hormones. These regulatory hormones then control the activity of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. Okay. However, with oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, they was able to travel along the axons to get to the posterior lobe. For the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, these regulatory hormones must reach their target by the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, and we'll explain that in just a second. And the third way of how, again, the hypothalamus integrates its neural and endocrine activity is via those autonomic centers in the hypothalamus, right? We're able to secrete these hormones, right, or provide secretion of these hormones from the adrenal gland, right, by these sympathetic preganglionic motor neurons. Okay. So looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, right, is also called the hypophysis, right? The pituitary gland is called the hypophysis, right? Remember, it sits, okay? It's going to sit in this hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica, right? The sella turcica of this sphenoid bone, okay, on the skull, okay? And notice how it's lined by that one of the folds of the dura mater, the craniodura mater, that diaphragma sellae, right? It's going to be in this area right here to protect the pituitary gland, to protect that neuroendocrine tissue from the bony structures of the sella turcica of that sphenoid bone, right? And we also see, right, this is the hypothalamus up here. The hypothalamus is going to connect to this pituitary gland via that infundibulum, right, via this infundibulum right here, okay? And so when we're looking at the pituitary gland, right, it's going to consist of two lobes, right? We have the anterior lobe right here that I'm doing in blue, right? And it wraps itself around right there. That anterior lobe is going to be called the adenohypophysis, right? The adenohypophysis. Whereas the posterior lobe, right? The posterior lobe is going to be called the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis. Okay? And so, as you can see right here, that neurohypophysis is going to be connected really by that infundibulum right there. Okay? This posterior lobe is going to release 2 peptide hormones, whereas the anterior lobe, right, or the adenohypophysis, is going to release 7 peptide hormones. Okay? So let's look at that. For the anterior lobe to release its 7 peptide hormones, right? Again, they're going to be responding to those regulatory hormones produced by the hypothalamus. How do those hypothalamic regulatory hormones engage or promote the release of those hormones from the anterior or the adenohypophysis portion of the pituitary gland? And it's going to be through this hypophysioportal system, right? So hormones from the adenohypophysis are controlled by the hypothalamic secretions. So these secretions are distributed to the adenohypophysis via the hypophysioportal system. Okay, so within the infundibulum, it's going to be a plexus of capillaries. Right, you're going to have that primary plexus, right, and we're going to be able to secrete. Right, those secretions will leave the primary plexus. They're going to enter the portal vessels, and from the portal vessels, they're going to arrive at the secondary plexus, and then that secondary plexus, it surrounds the 5 cell types of the adenohypophysis. And that's how those regulatory hormones will get from the hypothalamus to the adenohypophysis. So let's look at it, right? So you have neurons and the integrative centers, right? So you're going to have these regulatory hormones being produced there. But remember, when we're looking at this hypophysioportal system, right, we want to remember that one of the regions, or some of the regions, where the blood-brain barrier is going to be different from the rest of the body, from the rest of the brain, right, it's going to be in this area right here of that hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, right? And it's because it's going to be able to permit the diffusion of these hypothalamic hormones into the circulation, right, these large hormones, okay? So, number one, the neurons of the integrative centers, they're able to produce these regulatory hormones, right? These regulatory hormones are able to be then secreted into this primary capillary plexus, into this blood supply. Of course, we're going to have that superior hypophyseal artery that's going to deliver blood, right? Deliver blood to this primary capillary plexus, right? These hormones will diffuse into the blood supply right here of the primary capillary plexus. They're going to get transported down these portal vessels, right? These portal vessels will deliver the blood containing those regulatory hormones to the secondary capillary plexus, okay, within this anterior lobe. And so as we can see here, we have the different cell types, right? And we'll go over that in another video, all right? These different cell types. So now we have these regulatory hormones produced from the hypothalamus. Now they're in the blood supply surrounding these 5 different cell types. These hormones will get into these cells, right? And it will promote these cells to provide hormones to then get secreted into the blood supply. So now we have those hormones being secreted into the blood supply. Okay? And once those hormones from the anterior lobe are secreted into the blood supply, the hypophyseal veins will carry the blood containing the pituitary hormones, right, to the rest of the body. Okay? That was the anterior lobe. Now for the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, right, we have those neurons, right, and the hypothalamus, right? So in the supraoptic nuclei, right, of the hypothalamus, that nuclei will be able to produce ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, whereas in the paraventricular nuclei, that's going to produce oxytocin, right? So again, these hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, the ADH and the oxytocin, okay? However, they're transported via these axons, right, via those axons of the nerves, and they're able to then get into the blood supply, right, of the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland via this inferior hypophyseal artery, that inferior hypophyseal artery will deliver blood into a capillary plexus in the posterior lobe. This plexus is going to pick up the ADH and oxytocin that was released by the axons of the hypothalamic neurons. Okay, and of course, once those hormones are picked up into the blood supply, they'll then be released by that hypophyseal vein, right? That's going to carry blood containing those hormones to the rest of the body. Okay. So when we're looking at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, remember the anterior lobe is also called the adenohypophysis. It's going to be controlled. This anterior lobe is going to be controlled by those regulatory hormones secreted by the hypothalamus, right? But this anterior lobe is going to consist of three different regions. The pars distalis region, right? That pars distalis is going to be this main portion right here, right? That's going to secrete the majority of the hormones. You have this pars intermedius region. That's going to secrete the melanocyte stimulating hormone. And then you have this pars tuberalis right there. That pars tuberalis, this portion right here, and this portion right here, that's going to wrap itself around the infundibulum, right? So notice how that infundibulum really connects the hypothalamus to the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, but it's that anterior lobe that has to wrap itself around. Okay, that's why it's called the adenohypophysis. Okay, whereas the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis because it's in direct connection, right? It's in direct connection with the hypothalamus. Okay. So let's look at the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It's going to consist of 5 different cell types. Those thyrotropes that will release the thyroid-stimulating hormone, the corticotropes releasing the adrenocorticotropic hormone and the melanocyte-stimulating hormone. You have the gonadotropes that release the follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. And you have the lactotropes that release prolactin. And you have the somatotropes that release the growth hormone. Okay? So the anterior lobe, right? The hormones that will be released by the pars distalis is going to be the TSH, the ACTH, the FSH, the LH, the prolactin, and the growth hormone, right? Whereas in the intermedia region, right, we're going to have that melanocyte stimulating hormone, okay? So these are going to be the anterior pituitary hormones right here, right? But we're going to go in depth with them right now. So remember the hormones that are going to be produced by the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. That thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, it's going to stimulate or target the thyroid gland, right? It's going to cause the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones, right? Its own hormones, right? And those hormones are going to be T3, T4, and calcitonin, triiodothyronine, T3, and thyroxine, T4, right? The adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to target the adrenal cortex, right? The adrenal cortex, and it's going to cause the adrenal cortex to release those glucocorticoids. Okay. The follicle-stimulating hormone will target the ovaries in females, right, where it will cause the maturation of oocytes and cause the release of estrogen, whereas in males it's going to target those seminiferous tubules, right, and cause sperm production. The luteinizing hormone in females target the ovaries that will help to cause ovulation, and it's going to cause the release of progesterone, right? The progesterone, produce that progesterone hormone. And in males, it's going to target those interstitial cells, right? Causing the release of those androgens like the testosterone, as well as causing the release of estrogen as well, right? So both the follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone, those are going to be those gonadotropins. Okay. The prolactin will target the mammary glands. So it's going to cause the production of milk, right? So prolactin causes the production of milk, okay? And growth hormone, also called somatotropin, is going to target general cells, right? Skeletal muscles, ligaments, tissue, cartilage, right? For growth, right? Specifically causing protein synthesis, resulting in the growth of those tissues, right? It's also going to target the liver cells, causing the release of the somatometins, which will stimulate the protein synthesis in muscles and cartilage cells. Okay? The melanocyte-stimulating hormone All right, that's going to target the melanocyte cells of the skin and cause the production of melanin. Okay. In the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, posterior lobe is also called the neurohypophysis, right? It's going to be innervated by nerves from the hypothalamus. Remember, we have those nerves in the supraoptic nuclei and the nerves in the paraventricular nuclei, right? Sending those those hormones down via their axons. And so the hormones released by the hypothalamic neurons are called these neurosecretions. They're going to be the ADH, antidiuretic hormone, from the supraoptic nuclei, and the oxytocin from that paraventricular nuclei in the hypothalamus, right? So ADH, right, antidiuretic hormone, right? Diuretic or diuresis means to pee, anti means to not, right? So we don't want to pee, right? This ADH is also called vasopressin, right? This hormone is going to be released in a response to a rise in electrolyte concentration, as well as a fall in blood pressure, right? So it's going to target the nephrons of the kidneys, right? It's going to cause the kidneys to retain water, right? So we can prevent dehydration, okay? It causes the kidneys to retain water to prevent dehydration. It's also going to constrict those peripheral blood vessels, right? When we constrict those peripheral blood vessels, we're going to elevate our blood pressure. Okay, so we're bringing our blood pressure back up and retaining water. The posterior lobe will also release, right, oxytocin. Oxytocin will target the smooth muscles of the uterus, right? It's going to cause those contractions of the smooth muscles of the uterus, resulting in uterine contractions. Right? It's also going to target the contractile cells of the mammary glands, right? Specifically those myoepithelial cells of the mammary gland to release milk from the nipple, right? We want to release milk. So oxytocin helps with the release of milk, whereas remember prolactin, hormone from the anterior lobe, will produce milk. Okay. However, in males, oxytocin causes smooth muscle contractions within that prostate gland too. Okay. So that oxytocin in males will target the ductus deferens in the prostate, right? And this is going to cause contractions of the ductus deferens and prostate and ejection of secretions, okay? Prostatic secretions. When we're looking at the thyroid gland, remember the thyroid gland is going to be stimulated or targeted by that thyroid, the thyroid stimulating hormone, right? When we look at the thyroid gland, it's going to be on the anterior surface of the trachea, slightly inferior to that thyroid and cricoid cartilages. The thyroid gland is going to be easily palpated, right? It's going to be highly vascularized, right? Being supplied by the superior thyroid artery and the inferior thyroid artery. Looking at the thyroid artery, it's going to have two lobes to it, right? Two lobes to it that's going to be connected by this isthmus, okay? It's going to contain thyroid follicles. These thyroid follicles will store these thyroid hormones extracellularly. So you'll see that in that space. These thyroid follicles, right, they're going to be lined with simple cuboidal epithelium composed of T thyrocytes. These are going to be those follicular cells. We're going to have a follicle cavity, which is going to contain this colloid, and that's just going to be this viscous fluid, okay, containing large quantities of suspended proteins, right? These T thyrocytes, right, these follicular cells, follicle cells, these simple cuboidal cells, they're going to secrete thyroglobulin, right? They're going to secrete thyroglobulin and iodine into the colloid space. Thyroglobulin is made up of tyrosine and iodine, right? Two examples that we have is the thyroxine, the T4, and the triiodothyronine, right? This T3 and T4, right? The difference between T3 and T4 is the addition of an extra iodine group, right? So thyroxine has 4 iodine groups. Triiodothyronine, right? It has 3 iodine groups, all right? But these two hormones, T3 and T4, they're both very important because they help with the body's metabolic rate, right? They increase cellular metabolism and oxygen consumption in almost every cell of the body, right? So this is how we're able to maintain homeostasis, right? So as we can see right here, those cuboidal T thyrocytes, right? They make up the outer border of these thyroid follicles, and in the middle we have this thyroid follicle cavity made up of the colloid, right? So For example, let's say if your body is out of homeostasis, right? If you have a decreased amount of T3 and T4 circulating within the blood, right? What's going to happen is that's going to trigger the release of thyrotropinin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, right? That's going to target the adenohypophysis, right? The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. It's going to cause the release of that thyroid stimulating hormone. That thyroid stimulating hormone in turn is going to target the thyroid gland. It's going to trigger the release of T3 and T4, and now we can have a restored normal levels of T3, T4, right? So again, if you have low concentrations of T3 and T4 in the blood, right, or even low body temperature, right, the hypothalamus is going to sense that, right, and say, hey, okay, well, we need more T3, T4, right? So you can have that hypothalamus will produce the thyrotropinin releasing hormone, okay, that regulatory hormone, into the anterior lobe via that hypophyseal portal system, okay. That thyrotropinin releasing hormone will release the thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior lobe. That thyroid stimulating hormone will then target and affect the thyroid gland, right? The thyroid gland will then produce its own hormones, the T3 and T4, into circulation, and now that will increase the concentrations of T3 and T4, and now we are restored to good T3, T4 concentration levels in the blood, okay? There's another type of thyroid hormone, that seed thyrocyte. It's going to be that clear thyrocyte. These are going to be those parafollicular cells, right? So they're not necessarily associated with the follicle. So if we look, right, at the image that we just looked at, right, remember these are those seed thyrocytes, right? They are paraventricular, so they're not necessarily associated with the follicle, okay? Excuse me, they're going to be like on the outside of it, okay? However, these seed thyrocytes, they're going to produce calcitonin, okay? Calcitonin will be able to reduce the calcium levels, okay, in the blood, right? Calcitonin will respond to high calcium levels and reduce it. Okay, so it's going to target those osteoclasts in the bones, where it's going to inhibit osteoclast activity, right? And therefore, calcium ions do not leave the bones and enter the blood, right? Remember, osteoclasts break down bone, right, releasing calcium. So we want to tell these osteoclast cells to stop breaking down bone, thus stop making calcium get into the blood, okay? Calcitonin will also target the nephrons of the kidneys, where it's going to stimulate calcium ions to be excreted in the urine. Okay, if it's too much, we want to stop it from being released into the blood, and we want to excrete it out in our urine. Okay, and that's what calcitonin is going to do. Now, on the back of the thyroid gland, we have these parathyroid glands, right? These 4 parathyroid glands, okay, on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. Excuse me, again, they're going to be highly vascularized, right, being supplied by the superior and the inferior thyroid artery. There's going to be 2 major type of cells associated with the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid cells, these are these principal cells, and the oxyphil cells. Not many functions or really known functions of the oxyphil cells are known. However, the parathyroid cells, or these principal cells, they produce parathyroid hormone, PTH, right? Parathyroid hormone monitors blood calcium ion levels, right? So it monitors it on a day-to-day basis. Once it secretes parathyroid hormone, that's going to increase blood calcium ion levels, right? So if blood calcium ion levels are low, we're going to secrete, right, parathyroid hormone to increase blood calcium ion levels. How is it going to do this? Well, number one, this enzyme or this hormone, right, is going to reduce urinary excretion of calcium, right? So we're not going to pee it out. And it's also going to stimulate the kidneys to produce calcitriol. Calcitriol will increase the intestinal absorption of calcium ions, right? So we're going to absorb more calcium, okay? So it's going to get into the blood, right? We're going to stop peeing it out, and we're going to try to absorb more. Also, right, the release of this parathyroid hormone is going to target the osteoclasts as well. So we know in the kidneys, it's going to cause the kidneys to produce calcitriol, right? And again, calcitriol will promote the small intestines to absorb calcium ions into the bloodstream, thus increasing blood calcium ion levels. However, it's going to target the osteoclast as well. It's going to tell osteoclast, do your job, right? Because it's going to cause the osteoclast cells to remove calcium ions from the bone and put it into the blood, thus again increasing blood calcium ion levels, right? It's also going to cause the kidneys to reduce calcium ion excretion, right? Thus increasing blood calcium ion levels, right? So it's a three-pronged approach, right, to increase calcium ion levels in the body, in the blood. The thymus, another endocrine organ, right, is a gland posterior to the sternum, located in that mediastinum region. It produces those thymosins, and that's just a mixture of several different hormones, but it targets lymphocytes. It causes those lymphocytes to develop into T cells. These T cells are involved in maintaining an effective immune system. However, after puberty, we've noticed that the thymus will gradually atrophy. It gradually diminishes, right, in size. So over time, it atrophies and it becomes inconspicuous with old age, right? The adrenal glands, right, located on the superior portion, right, adjacent to the renal system, to the kidneys, right? They're going to sit right on top of the kidneys, right? They're also called the suprarenal glands, right? The adrenal glands, right? These glands, again, are going to be highly vascularized, supplied by branches from the renal artery, the phrenic artery, right, and parts of the aorta. The adrenal gland consists of two structural regions, the adrenal cortex, right? It's going to consist of the adrenal cortex, right? This outer portion, the superficial portion of the adrenal gland, and it's also going to contain of that deep portion, the medulla, right? Cortex on the outside, medulla on the inside, okay? Specifically looking at the adrenal cortex, right, is going to have three distinctive zones, right? And each zone is going to produce its unique corticosteroids. The zona glomerulosa, right, that most superficial zone of the cortex, is going to produce those mineral corticoids such as aldosterone. The zona fasciculata, right, the intermediate portion, is going to produce those glucocorticoids, right, cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. And we have this zona reticularis, right, the zona reticularis, that's going to be the deepest portion of the cortex, and that's going to produce small amounts of androgens. All right, so looking at the zona glomerulosa, right, it produces aldosterone, right? Produces aldosterone, okay? Produces aldosterone. Aldosterone will cause the retention of sodium ions and water, thereby reducing ion and water loss by the body, okay, to increase blood pressure. So we're going to keep sodium, but we're going to release some potassium, okay? And that's, again, that's what aldosterone is going to do. Right, cause the retention of sodium ions and water in the blood. The zona fasciculata, right? The zona fasciculata produces those cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, target the liver to cause the liver to synthesize glucose and glycogen. Okay, produce that in the blood. And then we have the zona reticularis, right? The zona reticularis is going to target general cells, cause the secretion of small amounts of androgens such as the testosterone. It's also going to cause, which in turn will the development of pubic hair. And this just gives you a table of the different regions of the cortex, as well as the medulla now, too, right? Well, the medulla, one whole medulla, right, produces those hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? That's going to increase cardiac activity, blood pressure, glycogen breakdown, blood glucose, and the release of lipids by adipose tissue. So we can see that right here, too, right? And the adrenal medulla is going to consist of two types of chromaffin cells. One is going to produce epinephrine. The other cell type is going to produce norepinephrine. Okay, epinephrine or adrenaline and norepinephrine or noradrenaline, they're going to be part of the sympathetic nervous system response, right? They're going to target most of the cells, right, where they can increase cardiac activity, increase blood pressure, increase glycogen breakdown, and increase muscular strength and endurance in times of need, right? Now, the kidneys have some endocrine functions as well, right, that we mentioned earlier with the calcitriol production. It also produces renin, right, an enzyme hormone, right? It's also going to produce erythropoietin, right? That's a peptide hormone that's going to produce more red blood cells. The heart has endocrine functions where it produces the atrionatriuretic peptide hormone, okay? So let's look at the kidneys first, right? The kidneys, when they respond to low blood pressure, the kidneys will release this protein, or this enzyme, renin, into the bloodstream. Renin will convert the circulating angiotensinogen, right? Angiotensinogen just circulates within the bloodstream inactively, is produced by the liver, okay? So once your body realizes you have low blood pressure, right? The kidneys will release renin into the bloodstream. Renin will convert the circulating angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Angiotensinogen, again, is going to be produced by the liver. Angiotensinogen 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, which is found predominantly in the capillaries of the lungs. Okay, so we have this angiotensinogen, which is converted to angiotensin 1, right, via renin. Angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2, right, by ACE, okay, the angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, angiotensin 2 stimulates the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone. Aldosterone is going to cause the kidneys to put sodium ions and water into the bloodstream, right? Thus raising the blood pressure back to homeostatic conditions. It also causes blood vessel constriction. When you constrict your blood vessels, you also can raise your blood pressure, thus bringing it back to homeostatic conditions, okay? Again, the kidneys will respond to low calcium ion levels, as remember that parathyroid hormone targets the kidneys, right? It's going to target the kidneys to tell the kidneys to release calcitriol. Okay, calcitriol again causes the small intestine to absorb calcium ions into the bloodstream. This will raise the calcium ion levels back, okay, to homeostatic conditions. And in the kidneys, we also obtain cholecalciferol, right, vitamin D from like your skin, right, different UV radiation wavelengths, right, as well as you ingest it dietarily, right, from your diet, right. Cholecalciferol is going to be converted to an intermediate product in the liver. Those liver products are going to be converted to calcitriol in the kidneys, and calcitriol is actually the biologically active form of vitamin D. Right, so the heart, when the heart responds to high blood pressure, right, the high blood pressure many times is going to be due to high volume, right? So the heart cells in the right atrium, they're going to be able to detect volume, right, high volume, okay? So the heart cells will release atrionatriuretic peptide hormone. These hormones inhibit ADH and aldosterone, right? Inhibit ADH and aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone will retain sodium, and wherever sodium goes, water will go, right? And it will inhibit ADH. Remember, ADH, retain water, right? So we don't want to retain the water anymore, right? Because their blood pressure is too low. So if we inhibit these hormones, right, we lose water and sodium ions, and thus our blood pressure and volume returns back to a homeostatic condition, right? It lowers. Now, the pancreas has both exocrine and endocrine functions. Its exocrine functions are mainly in the digestive system, right? Digestive purposes, where it produces those digestive enzymes. And the endocrine function will consist of those pancreatic islet cells, right? So those pancreatic islet cells contain 4 major cell types: alpha, beta, delta, and F cells, but they produce these hormones, right? So specifically, I want us to look at the pancreas producing these alpha cells of the pancreatic islet cells, right? The small endocrine-like tissue within the pancreas. These alpha cells, right? Alpha cells produce glucagon, right? The hormone glucagon. Glucagon stimulates the liver to break down glycogen to form glucose. So it stimulates the liver to put glucose into the bloodstream, right? So glucagon raises blood glucose levels, Whereas insulin, right, produced by beta cells. So beta cells produce the insulin hormone, okay? They increase the rate of glucose absorption by the body cells, so they lower blood glucose levels. Okay? Insulin literally acts as a key to open the cell and allow for blood glucose to enter each cell, thus reducing the concentration of sugar in the bloodstream, right? Then you have those somatostatins produced by the delta cells, and you have those pancreatic polypeptides produced by the F cells, okay? And as you can see here, this is a small portion, right, of the endocrine cells within the pancreas, right? And most of the cells of the pancreas are for its exocrine function, right? Its exocrine digestive function, okay? In the testes, right, testes have some endocrine tissue, right? Interstitial cells will release testosterone. This is going to promote the production of sperm, okay? It's going to also maintain the secretory glands and influence secondary sex characteristics in male, as well as stimulate muscle growth. You have nerve cells in the testes that will release inhibin, right? This inhibin will depress the secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland, and the inhibin and the follicle-stimulating hormone will interact to maintain sperm production at normal levels. Okay. Now, in the ovaries, the oocytes begin to develop within these follicles. It's the follicles and the oocytes that mature during the follicle-stimulating hormone. Okay? These follicles and the oocytes will mature because of the FSH. These follicular cells produce estrogen, especially estradiol, right? These mature eggs are ovulated due to the luteinizing hormone, and after ovulation, the follicle becomes a corpus luteum. That corpus luteum releases progesterone, right? And it also releases relaxin. Specifically, that progesterone will prepare the body for pregnancy, right? Progesterone targets the endometrial lining, causing a thickening of the lining to prepare a place for the implantation of a fertilized egg. Progesterone also targets mammary tissue, right? Causes that tissue to prepare for secretory functions. The ovaries will produce those relaxin, also prepares the body for pregnancy, where it relaxes, right? It loosens the pubic symphysis and it relaxes those cervical muscles, right? It also stimulates mammary gland development, right? And here goes those cells and the hormones that are being produced, right? The hormones of the reproductive system. And then we have the pineal gland, right? That small pineal gland, right? Also called the pineal body, part of the epithalamus. It contains neurons, glial cells, and those special secretory cells called those pinealocytes, right? They're going to synthesize the hormone melatonin, right? Melatonin, of course, this slows the maturation of sperm, oocytes, and reproductive organs. Also, its production rate rises at night and declines during the day. It's going to help with their wake-sleep cycle, right? And of course, with age, we exhibit relatively few changes with advancing age, right? So one can expect that the changes in reproductive hormones levels at puberty will significantly change, right? There's going to be a decline in the concentration of reproductive hormones at menopause in women, and there will be some age-related issues in many tissues resulting in reduced responsiveness to even normal levels of these circulating hormones. Okay? Thank you guys for listening.